Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth. It's Friday, and so we're going to be talking about finances on the Common Sense Christian channel. Today we want to look at stewardship, and specifically in the areas of how we can get our money under control. It does seem like sometimes we get so caught up with the everyday of our financial lives, and sometimes we actually feel like we're drowning because of the financial problems that we find ourselves facing, that we aren't often as good of stewards as we would like to be. And so we want to talk about some very basic financial principles that will help us to handle our money better with the express desire or purpose of becoming better stewards for God. And so we're going to be looking at a book that was written by a man named George S. Clason. George S. Clason was born in 1874. He was in the Spanish-American War, and then after he got out of the Army from that, he moved to Denver, Colorado, where he had a map firm. He was a cartographer. He was one that was credited with making one of the first, if not first, atlases of the United States and Canada. So the firm was very successful. He was a quite intelligent man. But about 1926, he started thinking more along the lines of helping people with their everyday finances. And so he started putting together a series of pamphlets, and he did so in a way that he hoped would be entertaining, or at least entertaining enough to where people would actually be able to read them, enjoy reading them, but still get the principles from them that he was hoping to pass on. And so from those pamphlets came a book called Gold Ahead, Cures for a Lean Purse, and then it was eventually narrowed down into a book called The Richest Man in Babylon. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is a part of The Richest Man of Babylon, and it involves a setting probably about 3,000 years ago, about 1000 BC in Babylon. And it involves a king of Babylon and his concerns for his people who were starting to struggle financially themselves. And so here's the setting. King Sargon has one of his royal advisors in, and he's talking to him about a problem that they've noticed, that the people just don't seem to have enough money to pay their bills. And so commerce is really going down in the city, and this once rich city is now starting to become an impoverished city. And the king wants to do something about that. So he and his chancellor start discussing different ideas for doing that. And the king's first question is, well, how did this happen? And the chancellor pointed out that not too long before that, they had been undertaking great projects, building canals, bringing water in from the Euphrates River into the city of Babylon, and great building projects to go along with that. But once those projects were done, so too was that stream of money that was going to paying the workers. And they set off a series of dominoes to where, since the workers no longer had as much money to spend, then the people they were dealing with also had reduced incomes. And it was getting to the point where the city was becoming quite poor. And so the king said, well, what can we do about it? What's happened to all the money that was spent on all these great projects? And the chancellor said, well, it seems to have found its way into the hands of just a few rich people who have learned the secret to building wealth and then keeping it. And the king wanted to know what they could do about it. And the chancellor just pointed out it was hard to take away those funds from those people who had earned it honestly because they knew how, and then give it to people who had not been as prudent with their funds. And so the king said, well, how can we teach everybody how to be able to handle their money better so that they too can become wealthy? And the chancellor and he talked about it for a while, and they decided what they would do is they would consult with the rich men of the town and find out what their secrets were. And in specific, they wanted to talk to Arcad, who was supposed to be the richest man in Babylon. And so they called Arcad in. He was 70 years old, but he was still straight in posture and had a gleam in his eye. And he appeared before the king and told him that he was at the king's service. What did the king require of him? And the king asked him, "Is it true, Arcad, that you're the richest man in Babylon?" And Arcad said, "Well, that's what people are saying and nobody's disputing it, so I guess it must be true." And the king said, "Well, how did you get there? Have you always been rich?" And Arcad said, "No, I started out with nothing but a desire to do well. And from there, I learned different secrets as how to make money. And those secrets just continued. When I applied those principles from those secrets, the money just continued to grow and grow until you see me here standing today as the richest man in Babylon." And the king said, "Well, can it be taught to others? Can these secrets be taught to others?" And this is something that I think is one of the most important parts of this little parable. Arcad said it's practical. What can be learned can be taught to others. Well, that was just what the king wanted to hear, and so they set up a way to pass this on to other people with Arcad as the teacher, and they selected 100 people from the city of Babylon who would come in and be part of that first class with the idea that Arcad would pass along to them the secrets of building wealth. So, the day came. Just 2 weeks later, Arcad is standing at the center of a group that are of 100 men that are all seated on carpets around him, and he starts talking to them about the principles of building wealth. But before he does that, he starts off by asking each one of the men what they do for a living. And so the first man that he called on, well, he said, "I'm a scribe. I engrave in clay various records that people want to have." And Arcad said, "Well, you've got a good start then. This is the same thing that I did when I started. I was a scribe, and I can assure you that my purse was just as lean as yours is." He went to the next man. Well, he was a butcher. He bought goats from the farmers, and then he slaughtered those goats, sold the meat to the housewives and the skins to the sandal makers, and on around the room he went and found out what each man did. And then he said, "Here is the first principle that I want to pass on to you. In order to cure your lean purse," which is what they kept their gold coins and silver coins in order to cure a lean purse, you're first going to have to get it to fattening. Well, that's a rather obvious thing, but he didn't stop there. He told him how to do that. He stopped and he talked to a gentleman who had already identified himself as an egg merchant, and he said, "Suppose that you had a bowl filled with 10 eggs, and you only took 9 of those eggs out to sell, but you kept 1, and you did this day after day, each day leaving, only taking out 1 less egg than you put in. What would happen?" And the egg merchant said, "Well, eventually the bowl would overflow." And Arcad smiled and he held up his purse, which was fat and overflowing. And he said, "This is going to be the first principle." He said, just like the egg merchant, if he was to save 1/10 of his eggs back each day, would soon have an abundance of eggs. If we will take only 90% of the coins that we get in each day or each week, keeping out 1 of those coins for savings, before too long our purses are going to start fattening, and we will start having a savings that will benefit us. And he said, one of the things that you're going to find if you will do this is and he said, "I can't explain why it happens, but if you will take out that first 10% for yourself and then live on the other 90%, you're going to find that you're not going to miss that first 10%. And he said, even further than that, you're going to find that money just seems to start flowing to you easier. And he said, maybe it's just one of the principles of money. It seems like you have more coming in when you're not so desperate for every penny that comes in. And so think about that in your own life, and think about how often we live from paycheck to paycheck. And when we finally get a raise, it just came just in time for us to be able to meet some more expenses that we had. And so it just seems like when we're behind, we can never catch up. The idea behind starting to become a better steward for God is to have something that is intentional, something that is well thought out, a plan to start getting a little bit ahead. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but let's leave that for now. He just told his class, that's enough for today. Just start saving 1 coin for every 9 you get in. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. You think about it, ask any questions you want to ask about it tomorrow. And tomorrow I'm going to reveal the second cure for a lean purse. And so the next day came, and he started talking to them about this. He said, the second cure for a lean purse is this: keep control over your expenditures. He said, a well thought out budget will help guard your fattening purse from robbers. And so his indication was, use your budget as a soldier to guard the savings that you do have. And so he started talking about how to do a budget and on. And well, there was one man in a red and gold robe, and he raised his hand and he said, look, I'm a free man. I don't want to be held under the constraints of a budget. I want to be free to spend my money in the way I want to. I don't want to be under the shackles and the bondage of a budget. And so our CAD said, well, who would set the budget? And the man said, well, I would. And he said, well, consider this. Consider a pack mule about to go on a journey. If the pack mule was going to decide what was going to be loaded onto his back, wouldn't he be concerned first with the straw and with the grain and with containers of water for the journey? Well before he would consider any other items that may or may not be as necessary to sustain him on that journey, such as jewels and bars of gold and so on. And he said, you're smarter than a pack animal. You can figure out what you need for your necessary expenses first and foremost. And then after you've taken care of your necessary expenses, then you can start looking at fulfilling all your desires and wants that you have with what's left over from the 9 out of 10 coins that you have for expenses. And then he pointed this out. He said, there's 100 men in this room, and each one of you has varying degrees of income, and each one of you has varying degrees of expenses. Some of you have larger families and therefore larger expenses, yet each one of you has said that you have a lean purse that you want to do something about. And he said, the fact is that most people will spend everything they have, and they will start looking as necessary expenses their desires, to the point where before you know it, every bit of money they have coming in is spent on what they consider necessary, yet not everything is necessary. He said a budget is going to help you protect against that. You start out with things that truly are necessary, that give you 100% value for the expense that you are entailing. Your food, your clothing, your shelter, the animals that you have to ride for your transportation, and on and on. These things you want to make sure that you're getting 100% value for your expenses. And after you've done that, then you can start looking at the desires you have and the wants you have. Of course, they will always be more than you have available. This is true whether you're operating off of 100% of your income or 90% of your income. And so just start with the 90% and then take care of the desires and wants that you have. And he said you're going to find that you will be spending the money that you have on the things that you really need or the things that you really want. Well, now let's start talking about how that applies to us today. These first two principles, saving 10% of your income out and doing so with the assistance of a budget to where you know what your real expenses are, as well as being able to figure out what you really want to do with any money that you might have left over. And I want to look at this first and foremost from a Christian principle. Some of you will have already thought of this and are way ahead of me on this, but before you even take that 10% out for you, the very first thing you need to do is set aside a sum of money for God, for your contribution. In the Old Testament, during the time of the patriarchs, or a good part of the time of the patriarchs, before Israel even left the bondage of Egypt and Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, the patriarchs, many of them, still gave a tithe of what they had, 10%. And then under the law of Moses, they were required to give a tithe, or 10%. But the New Testament, it's different than that. We are told that we're to make a contribution on the first day of every week. So we do know it's got to be regular. We're told that it has to be in keeping with our income. So we need to be generous with what we have, but we also need not to exceed our income because we feel guilty for not being able to give more. There will be times you want to give more, but you just cannot. So you give in keeping with your income. But just like in the Old Testament, where they gave of the first and the best. Under the law of Moses, they were to take the first and the strongest and the best of their herds, an animal without blemish. And that's what we need to be doing. Whatever we decide, and that's going to be personal between you, or if you're married, between you and your spouse, whatever you decide that is the best use of the funds that God has given you, you set that aside for God first. And then you take the rest of it and you divide that into the 10% and the 90%, and take the first 10% after your giving, whatever your giving was, you take the first 10% and you put it aside in savings, and then you start taking care of your necessary expenses, and then you can start looking at spending the rest of that money on things that you would like to have and like to do. Well, there are going to be times in your life where your expenses are so high that you find that there's no money left for desires and wants. There's just nothing left over at the end of it. Well, this is one of the reasons why we need to get our expenses under control in the first place. Because I, like perhaps you, have had times in my life where every penny I had coming in was already spoken for. And it's a very uncomfortable way to live. It's a very unsettled way to live. If before you get to that point, you can get in the practice, first, of taking care of your giving to God, but second, taking care of setting aside a portion of your income for savings, you will find then that you're going to be a lot more prudent with what you have to do with the other 90%. And you're also going to be a lot more careful about entering into expenses you don't have to have. And there are strategies that you can use for making the 90% stretch far enough to do everything you want to do. You don't have to have a new car. If you don't already have one, I would recommend that you never get a new car again in your life unless you can afford to pay for it comfortably with cash. A good $5,000 used car is going to get you just as far, and they're just as quick. You'll have more repairs, but you're going to have more money to deal with those repairs. And you're also going to have more money available to you. A lot of people enjoy different little pleasures during the day. Starbucks coffee, let me give you an example. For instance. Some people will go and they'll start their day off by swinging by Starbucks, and they'll get them a $7 coffee. And they'll do that every day. And it's just $7. Well, that's $7. It's not just that, though. You also have the expense of the fuel to go out of your way to wherever you were going to go to that Starbucks. So you have a fuel cost. You have a time investment as well. And if you're self-employed, maybe you're a farmer or a rancher or a professional in some other area, your time is worth something. And if you're spending that time standing in line, that time really is money. And so do you really need that Starbucks coffee every day? Or could you get by, as I have found, I can get by very nicely with a nice cup of Folgers instant coffee, or brew whatever you want, but you're going to find that you can spend pennies instead of dollars. $7 a day plus the rest of the expenses that go along with that are going to end up being about $10 a day or more, and that's going to be over $3,500 a year. Surely you could find a better use for $3,500 in a year's time than just drinking it from a cup of coffee. Well, you may have other habits and desires that you enjoy partaking in, that are not sinful for you to enjoy partaking in. And I'm not saying give all those up. I'm just saying be a little bit more prudent, be a little bit more strategic in the way that you meet some of these wants and desires, and you will find that your budget becomes something that's more and more manageable, all the time while fattening your purse and giving you an excess that someday will not only get you things that you really want to have, but will even more so, if you invest that fattening purse wisely, maybe be able to allow you to accomplish some of the dreams you have. All of this is in the context of being the best steward we can be for God. Give to Him first and generously. Be prudent with the rest of the funds that you have and the expenses that you take on, and do so cheerfully, not in a way that you start to enjoy life more perhaps than you have. And I can say this, as speaking as one who's been in way more debt than I should have been at different times in my life, it's a whole lot more fun to not be worrying about this crushing debt and be looking towards maybe fulfilling some dreams and goals that you might have because you've been more prudent, than it is to just rush in and never deny yourself anything that you want by spending every cent of every paycheck that you get in. We are stewards of God. He wants us to enjoy ourselves, yes, but He also wants us to live within our means, and He wants us to give Him first consideration. If we can do all that, we're going to be pretty successful in life. It's going to be a good life, and then there will be heaven someday. The first two steps are put 10% aside, get you a budget to help guard that 10%. We'll talk about the other 5 cures for a lean purse next Friday, but for now, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate your time. Pray that God will richly bless you for the rest of this week.